The fluorescent lights of Mount Olive Baptist Church cast long shadows across the polished wooden pews, each beam of afternoon sun filtering through stained glass like judgment itself. Marcus Reed stood 3 feet from his father's casket, close enough to see the careful stitching on James Reed's only good suit, far enough that the distance felt like a chasm he'd never cross. 200 faces filled the sanctuary, most of them strangers who'd come to pay respects to a man they'd known as the quiet maintenance supervisor who fixed their leaking faucets and never complained about the overtime. None of them knew what Marcus was about to learn. Victoria Hartwell's hand landed on his shoulder with the weight of authority she'd wielded over him for 8 years, her diamond rings catching light as she leaned close enough that he could smell her Chanel No. 5 mixing with the funeral home's lilies. Her voice carried that particular tone she'd perfected, the one that sounded like concern to anyone listening, but landed like a slap to anyone who knew better. "Marcus, dear, I think you'll be more comfortable in the back. These front rows are reserved for immediate family." The words hung in the air between them, each syllable carefully chosen to sound reasonable while cutting deep. Immediate family, as if 8 years of marriage to her daughter Elena hadn't earned him the right to mourn his own father in the front row. As if the man in that casket hadn't been the only parent Marcus had left since his mother passed when he was 17. As if any of these people crowding the church had spent half the time with James Reed that Marcus had spent every Sunday for 35 years. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, the muscles in his neck going rigid the way they always did when Victoria decided to remind him of his place. He could feel Elena's presence to his right, could sense her shifting weight from one expensive heel to the other, could almost hear the internal calculation she was running about whether this was the moment she'd finally speak up. 8 years of these moments, 8 years of waiting for her to choose him over her mother's approval, and 8 years of the same outcome. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is my father's funeral." His voice came out steady despite the heat rising in his chest, despite the awareness that every eye in the sanctuary had shifted toward them, despite knowing that this moment would end the same way every confrontation with Victoria ended. He kept his hands at his sides, kept his posture straight, kept his dignity intact, even as she stripped it away piece by piece in front of 200 witnesses. Victoria's smile never wavered, that practiced expression of false warmth she'd mastered over decades of social climbing. Her silver hair was perfect despite the August humidity. Her black dress cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, and her ability to make condescension sound like kindness remained unmatched. "Of course it is, sweetheart, but we have to think about appearances. Pastor Williams has saved these seats for people who actually knew James well. You understand." People who actually knew James well. The phrase landed like a physical blow, and Marcus watched Victoria's eyes flicker with satisfaction as she registered the impact. She'd drawn blood with 4 words, standing in a church full of mourners who had no idea that the man being buried had raised Marcus alone after his mother died, that James had worked double shifts to keep Marcus in college, that father and son had shared Sunday dinners every single week for 18 years, until James got too sick to leave the hospital. Diane Hartwell materialized beside her mother, Victoria's oldest daughter and Elena's sister, her designer handbag clutched tight enough that her knuckles showed white. At 32, Diane had perfected her mother's particular brand of cruelty, though she lacked Victoria's subtlety. Where Victoria used a scalpel, Diane preferred a hammer. "Mother's right. These front rows are for people who actually mattered to Mr. Reed." She emphasized the surname, refusing even now to acknowledge the family connection, refusing to call him Dad or James or anything that might suggest Marcus belonged to something worth respecting. Her voice carried across the sanctuary, ensuring that anyone who'd missed Victoria's opening salvo caught this follow-up punch. The sanctuary fell silent, except for the soft organ music drifting from the choir loft, some hymn Marcus couldn't name because his mind had gone blank with humiliation. He could feel the weight of all those eyes, could sense the whispered questions starting to ripple through the pews, could measure the exact distance between where he stood and where strangers now occupied the seats that should have been his by right. Elena stood frozen between her mother and her husband, her dark eyes fixed on the floor, her jaw working like she was chewing through words she'd never let escape. Marcus waited, the way he'd waited through 8 years of these moments, the way he'd learned to wait, because sometimes waiting was all a man had when the people who claimed to love him chose silence over solidarity. She lifted her gaze, met his eyes for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, and Marcus saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, maybe. Shame, possibly. But not courage. Never courage. She looked away, turning her body slightly toward her mother and sister, a physical choice that spoke louder than any words she might have offered in his defense. The betrayal cut deeper than Victoria's condescension or Diane's open contempt, because Elena's silence was a choice she made fresh every single time, a wound she reopened with deliberate precision whenever the moment demanded she choose between her husband and her family's comfort. Fine. The word came out flat, empty of the anger burning through his chest, because anger required energy, and Marcus had spent 8 years learning that resistance only prolonged the humiliation. He stepped back from his father's casket, felt his shoes sink slightly into the thick burgundy carpet that probably cost more than his car, and moved toward the rear of the sanctuary with his head up and his shoulders back, because his father had taught him that dignity was something you carried inside, not something other people could strip away, no matter how hard they tried. I'll stand in the back. Like always, he let that last phrase hang in the air, let it sit there long enough that Victoria's smile flickered for just a moment before she recovered. Like always. Because this wasn't new, wasn't surprising, wasn't anything except the latest iteration of a pattern that had defined his marriage from the moment Elena's family realized their daughter had married someone they considered beneath her. Marcus made his way down the center aisle, feeling the weight of 200 pairs of eyes tracking his progress, hearing the whispers start to build as people leaned toward their neighbors to speculate about what they'd just witnessed. Behind him, he caught Elena's voice, soft and pleading, but the words were aimed at her mother, not at him. Always at her mother, never at him. He found space against the back wall, positioning himself where he could still see his father's casket through the gaps between standing mourners, where he could hear Pastor Williams when the service started, where he could fulfill his obligation to be present, even if he'd been denied the right to be present where it mattered. Strangers filled the front rows now, settling into seats with the easy comfort of people who belonged, who'd never been told their grief wasn't welcome, who'd never had to measure their worth against someone else's judgment. The organ music shifted, signaling the start of the service, and Pastor Williams emerged from the vestry in his black robes, his weathered face carrying the kind of wisdom that came from presiding over joy and grief in equal measure for 40 years. He'd baptized Marcus, had counseled James through the dark months after Marcus's mother died, had married Marcus and Elena in this same sanctuary 8 years ago, while Victoria sat in the front row, radiating disapproval that everyone pretended not to notice. We gather today to celebrate the life of James Theodore Reed, a man who embodied quiet strength and unwavering dignity in all his endeavors. The words washed over Marcus as he stood pressed against the wall, his view partially blocked by the tall man in front of him, his ability to mourn his father constrained by the physical distance Victoria had imposed. Quiet strength, unwavering dignity. The pastor's description fit James perfectly, and Marcus felt something crack inside his chest as he thought about all the ways his father had demonstrated those qualities, all the times James had faced hardship without complaint, all the moments when dignity was the only thing James had to offer, and he'd offered it freely. The eulogy continued, Pastor Williams sharing stories about James's dedication to his work, his commitment to his church community, his willingness to help anyone who needed an extra hand or a listening ear. Marcus heard about the family whose heat James had fixed for free during a particularly brutal winter, about the young couple whose plumbing crisis James had solved at 3 a.m. without asking for overtime pay, about the elderly widow whose groceries James had carried up 4 flights of stairs every Saturday for 2 years. Good stories, true stories, stories that painted an accurate picture of James Reed as a man who measured success by how he treated people rather than what he accumulated. But none of the stories mentioned the part that mattered most to Marcus, the part that made his throat tight and his eyes burn as he stood in the back like an afterthought. None of them talked about the father who'd worked 3 jobs to keep his son in college after the scholarships ran out, who taught Marcus that a man's worth came from his character rather than his bank account, who'd sat through every one of Marcus's accounting presentations at Georgia State, even though the technical jargon might as well have been ancient Greek. None of them captured the Sunday dinners where James would listen to Marcus talk about his week, would offer advice without judgment, would remind his son that patience always got rewarded, even when the reward felt impossible to imagine. Marcus's mind drifted to 3 weeks ago, the last real conversation he'd had with his father before the pneumonia that had been brewing quietly suddenly turned critical. They'd been sitting in James's small apartment, the 1-bedroom place in East Atlanta that James had lived in for 20 years, despite never seeming to struggle with money the way Marcus struggled, despite always having enough to help Marcus with unexpected expenses, despite maintaining a calm financial stability that Marcus had always attributed to James's legendary frugality and careful planning. "Son, I need you to promise me something." James's voice had been weak, but clear. His breathing labored from the infection spreading through his lungs, his hand gripping Marcus's with surprising strength for a man who'd lost 15 pounds in 2 weeks. "Anything, Dad. What do you need?" "When they come at you, and they will come at you, I need you to remember your worth. Not the worth other people assign you. Not the worth that comes from a bank account or a job title or who you're married to. The worth you were born with. The worth that can't be taken away no matter how hard anyone tries." Marcus had assumed James was talking about Victoria and her daughters, about the constant pressure they applied to make Marcus feel small, about the way they'd spent 8 years trying to convince him he should be grateful they tolerated his presence in Elena's life. He'd nodded, had promised to remember, had tried not to think about what it meant that his father felt the need to extract this particular promise. "There's an envelope in my desk drawer. Don't open it until after my funeral. Not before. Promise me that, too." The request had seemed odd at the time, almost paranoid, but Marcus had promised because what else did you do when your father was dying and asking for reassurance? He'd retrieved the envelope from James's desk, had tucked it into his jacket pocket, had felt its weight against his chest during the 2 weeks between that conversation and the moment James stopped breathing in the ICU at Grady Memorial. The envelope sat in his jacket pocket now, 3 feet away from his father's casket, waiting for whatever revelation James had deemed important enough to save for after his death. Pastor Williams concluded the eulogy with a prayer, his voice carrying across the sanctuary with the kind of practiced resonance that came from decades of leading congregations through grief. Marcus bowed his head and tried to focus on the words, tried to find comfort in the familiar rhythm of prayer, but his mind kept circling back to the envelope and James's cryptic insistence about timing, about waiting until after the funeral, about the way his father's eyes had locked onto his with an intensity that suggested this mattered more than Marcus understood. The prayer ended, and Pastor Williams invited mourners to come forward to pay their respects, to view the body one final time before they closed the casket for the procession to Oakland Cemetery. The front rows emptied first, strangers who'd been granted priority access filing past James's casket with appropriate expressions of sorrow, some touching the polished wood gently, others pausing to whisper prayers Marcus couldn't hear from his position 40 feet away. Elena stood in line with her mother and sisters, her posture stiff, her hands clasped in front of her like she was holding herself together through force of will. She'd worn the black dress Marcus had bought her for his mother's funeral 5 years ago, and he wondered if she'd chosen it deliberately, if she was trying to signal some connection to his grief, even as her actions signaled the opposite. Victoria kept one hand on Elena's elbow, a gesture that looked supportive to casual observers, but probably felt like a leash to anyone who understood their dynamic. Diane and Natalie flanked them, a united front of Hartwell women presenting a picture of family solidarity that excluded the one person who should have been standing with them. Marcus waited until the line thinned, until most of the crowd had paid respects and moved toward the fellowship hall, where the church ladies had prepared a reception with fried chicken and potato salad and sweet tea in quantities sufficient to feed an army. He pushed off from the wall and made his way forward, aware that people were watching, aware that his isolation had become part of the spectacle, aware that his father's funeral had turned into a public demonstration of exactly how the Hartwell family viewed their son-in-law. He reached the casket and placed his hand on the smooth wood, feeling the cool surface beneath his palm, seeing his father's face peaceful in death, in a way it hadn't been peaceful in the last weeks of his life. James looked smaller somehow, diminished by death in a way that made Marcus want to argue with the universe, to demand an explanation for why good men died while people like Victoria Hartwell continued to wield their cruelty like a weapon they'd inherited along with their grandmother's silver. "I miss you, Dad. Already. I don't know how to do this without you." The words came out barely above a whisper, meant for James alone, meant for the father who'd taught him how to tie a tie and balance a checkbook and maintain his dignity when the world tried to strip it away. Marcus felt his throat tighten, felt the burn behind his eyes that signaled tears he couldn't afford to shed here, couldn't afford to let Victoria and her daughters witness and weaponize later. A hand touched his shoulder, and Marcus turned to find Pastor Williams standing beside him, the older man's face creased with genuine concern. "Your father was proud of you, Marcus. He told me so many times. Said you had more strength than you knew." "Thank you, Pastor. That means a lot. There's a gentleman in my office who needs to speak with you. Says it's urgent. Related to your father's affairs." Marcus frowned, trying to place who might need to speak with him urgently enough to interrupt a funeral. James's life had been simple, his affairs straightforward, his death expected enough that Marcus had assumed any legal or financial matters would be handled in the coming weeks, not during the actual service. "Do you know who he is?" "Attorney named Thurston Drake. Said your father retained him specifically to handle matters after his passing. He's quite insistent about the timing." Something cold settled in Marcus's stomach. Some instinct that suggested urgency during a funeral meant complications he wasn't prepared to handle. But James had been meticulous about everything, had planned his own service down to the hymn selection, had arranged for his body to be cremated after the viewing to spare. The hallway was cooler than the sanctuary, air-conditioned to a temperature that made Marcus's skin prickle after the August heat, and his footsteps echoed on the tile floor as they approached the pastor's office at the end of the corridor. Pastor Williams knocked once and pushed the door open, revealing a man in his early 60s seated in one of the visitor chairs facing the desk. Thurston Drake stood as they entered, extending his hand with the kind of practiced professionalism that suggested decades of managing delicate legal situations. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Marcus earned in a month, silver-rimmed glasses that caught the light, and carried a leather briefcase that looked older than Marcus but maintained with the care of something valuable. "Mr. Reed, I apologize for the timing, but your father was extremely specific about when this conversation needed to occur. Thank you, Pastor Williams, for facilitating." Pastor Williams nodded and withdrew, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to seal Marcus into whatever came next. Drake gestured to the chair beside him, and Marcus sat, feeling the envelope in his jacket pocket press against his ribs like a reminder of James's cryptic instructions. "Mr. Reed, I'm Thurston Drake. I've been your father's attorney for the past 6 years, handling various legal and financial matters on his behalf. Your father left very specific instructions about how to handle his estate, and he insisted that certain information be conveyed to you immediately following his funeral service. Not before, not after. Immediately." 6 years. Marcus tried to reconcile that timeline with what he knew about his father's life, tried to remember any mention of legal matters or financial complications that might have required ongoing attorney representation. James had lived simply, had worked as a maintenance supervisor at various apartment complexes around Atlanta, had retired 2 years ago on what he'd called a modest pension that seemed to cover his needs without much left over. Nothing in that profile suggested the kind of life that required 6 years of legal counsel. "I didn't know Dad had an attorney. He never mentioned it." "Your father was a remarkably private man regarding his financial affairs. He had his reasons, which will become clear shortly. Before we proceed, I need to verify your identity." Drake pulled a folder from his briefcase and spent 3 minutes confirming Marcus's social security number, date of birth, mother's maiden name, and current address. The verification felt excessive for a modest estate that Marcus had assumed consisted of whatever remained in James's checking account and the few personal possessions scattered through his small apartment. But Drake's thoroughness suggested this was more complicated than Marcus had anticipated, and that cold feeling in his stomach intensified as the attorney finally seemed satisfied and returned the verification documents to his briefcase. "Mr. Reed, your father's estate is valued at approximately $12.8 million. The words hung in the air like a physical object, something Marcus could almost see floating between them, something that made no sense in any context he could construct. $12.8 million? His father, James Reed, who wore the same work boots until the soles separated from the uppers, who drove a 1998 Chevy pickup until the transmission finally gave out last year, who'd lived in the same one-bedroom apartment for 2 decades despite having the means to move somewhere better. $12.8 million. I'm sorry, what? Your father's estate is valued at approximately $12.8 million. This includes 23 rental properties throughout the Atlanta metropolitan area, a diversified investment portfolio consisting primarily of blue-chip stocks and municipal bonds, and the residence in Buckhead, where your father actually lived for the past 15 years. Marcus felt like the floor had tilted beneath his chair, like gravity had shifted and he was falling even though he remained seated. 23 properties. Buckhead residence. His father had lived in East Atlanta, in that cramped apartment where they'd shared Sunday dinners at a table that seated 2 people if they didn't mind their elbows touching. His father had driven a truck held together with duct tape and prayer until Marcus had helped him buy a used Honda last year. His father had been a maintenance supervisor, had fixed toilets and replaced light bulbs and patched drywall for 40 years before retiring. That's impossible. My father lived on a pension. He had maybe $1,200 a month. We talked about his budget. He showed me the numbers. Drake's expression carried something that might have been sympathy mixed with professional detachment. The look of a man who'd delivered this kind of information before and knew exactly how recipients would react. Your father showed you what he wanted you to see, Mr. Reed. In reality, James Reed began acquiring rental properties in 1985, starting with a small duplex in East Point that he purchased with money he'd saved from his military service and overtime work. Over the next 40 years, he systematically reinvested rental income into additional properties, taking advantage of Atlanta's real estate market during both boom and recession periods. He lived modestly, not from necessity, but from choice. He wanted to build something substantial, and he wanted to do it quietly. Marcus tried to process the information, tried to reconcile the father he'd known with this shadow figure who'd been running a real estate empire while pretending to struggle on a fixed income. Every Sunday dinner where James had listened to Marcus worry about making rent, every Christmas where Marcus had felt guilty about not being able to afford better gifts, every time Marcus had offered to help with bills and James had politely declined, saying he was managing fine. All of it had been theater, carefully constructed to maintain an illusion Marcus had never questioned, because why would a son question whether his father was secretly wealthy? Why? Why would he live like that if he had this kind of money? Drake opened the folder again and pulled out an envelope, this one different from the one Marcus carried in his pocket. This one marked with James's handwriting that spelled out Marcus's full name. Your father wanted me to give you this after I explained the financial situation. He said it would answer your questions better than I could. Marcus took the envelope with hands that had started trembling, his fingers clumsy as he tried to open the seal without tearing the paper inside. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten in James's careful script, the same handwriting that had appeared on birthday cards and grocery lists, and the note that had directed Marcus to the first envelope still unopened in his pocket. My dear son, if you're reading this, then Thurston has just told you something that probably feels like I've been lying to you for your entire adult life. I want you to understand why. And I want you to understand what I've been building and why I built it the way I did. Marcus's vision blurred slightly as he read, his father's voice echoing in his head with each word. James's cadence and inflection so familiar that it felt like having him present in the room. I started buying property when you were 8 years old, right after your mother died. I was angry, Marcus. Angry at the world for taking her, angry at myself for not being able to save her, angry at the unfairness of a good woman dying while cruel people continued living. I channeled that anger into work, into saving every penny I could spare, into finding deals other people overlooked. I bought that first duplex with $20,000 I'd saved from military service and 5 years of overtime, and I turned it into my mission. The letter detailed James's strategy, his careful analysis of Atlanta's neighborhoods, his willingness to buy properties other investors considered too risky or too much work. He'd done his own maintenance, had managed his own tenants, had reinvested every dollar of profit into the next property until his portfolio grew from 1 duplex to 23 rental units, generating steady income that James had continued to plow back into stocks and bonds. But I kept living simply, Marcus. And I never told you about the money because I wanted you to know something more important than your net worth. I wanted you to know your own worth, the kind that comes from who you are rather than what you have. I watched how Elena's family treated you, saw how they measured your value in dollars and social connections, observed how they made you feel less than human because you drove an old car and worked as an accountant instead of a doctor or a lawyer or whatever they thought was worthy of their daughter. Marcus stopped reading, the words hitting too close to the wound that had just been reopened at his own father's funeral. The reminder that James had witnessed every slight, every dismissal, every moment when Victoria and her daughters had made their contempt clear. His father had known, had documented, had watched Marcus endure 8 years of humiliation, and had chosen not to intervene. The betrayal of that felt almost as sharp as the betrayal of discovering James had been wealthy all along. I didn't tell you about the money because I wanted you to build your own strength, to find your own dignity, to learn that your worth doesn't come from what you own, but from who you are when you think you have nothing. I watched you maintain your composure through 8 years of treatment no man should endure from his wife's family. I watched you stay calm when Victoria insulted you to your face. I watched you hold your tongue when Diane mocked your career. I watched you continue to show up, continue to be present, continue to extend respect to people who gave you none in return. The letter's tone shifted, became more urgent, more personal. The envelope I gave you before I died, the one I told you not to open until after the funeral, contains documentation of everything the Hartwell family has said and done to you over the past 8 years. I hired an investigator, Marcus. I recorded conversations, collected emails, documented instances where they treated you like you were beneath them. I did this not out of cruelty, but out of protection. Because I knew that when you inherited this money, they would come for it. They would try to claim it, manipulate you into sharing it, convince Elena to divorce you and take half. I wanted you to have proof of who they really are when the stakes get raised. Marcus felt his chest constrict, felt the weight of his father's foresight and planning, felt the complicated tangle of emotions that came from realizing James had been orchestrating something more complex than a simple inheritance. The envelope in his pocket suddenly felt heavier, more significant, like Pandora's box waiting to be opened and release consequences Marcus couldn't begin to predict. The money is yours, son. All of it. Use it however you see fit. But remember what I taught you about dignity, about patience, about measuring your worth by your character rather than your bank account. Remember that wealth reveals who people really are, and sometimes what it reveals isn't pretty. Be careful who you trust. Be careful who you let close. And most importantly, be careful with your own heart. Because the hardest thing to do when you finally have power is to use it without becoming the kind of person you used to despise. The letter concluded with James's signature, that familiar scrawl that Marcus had seen on permission slips and report cards, and the checks James had written to help Marcus through college. Marcus folded the pages carefully and slipped them back into the envelope, his hands still trembling, his mind racing through implications he couldn't fully process while sitting in Pastor Williams's office with a lawyer waiting for his response. Mr. Reed, I need to explain the immediate next steps. Your father structured his estate very carefully to minimize tax implications and ensure a smooth transfer. All the properties are held in an LLC, with you listed as the sole beneficiary. The investment accounts are already in your name through a trust your father established. The Buckhead house is titled directly to you. From a legal standpoint, this inheritance is complete and protected. Protected. The word caught Marcus's attention, pulled him out of the spiral of emotions and back to the practical reality of what Drake was saying. Protected from what? Protected from whom? Protected from what, exactly? Drake's expression shifted slightly, became more guarded, more careful. Your father was concerned about potential challenges to his estate. He took steps to ensure that his wishes were ironclad, legally speaking. The documentation is meticulous, the trail is clear, and there are no grounds for anyone to contest his distribution of assets. Anyone. Drake meant the Hartwell family, meant Victoria and her daughters, meant Elena. James had anticipated their response to discovering Marcus had inherited millions, had prepared defenses against claims Marcus hadn't even known to expect. The realization that his father had spent his final years building legal fortifications against Marcus's own wife and her family added another layer of betrayal to the already complicated emotional landscape. There's one more thing, Mr. Reed. Your father left specific instructions that his will must be read aloud at his funeral, in front of all the mourners present. He was quite insistent about this, and he asked me to ensure you remained present for that reading. It will happen at the conclusion of the service, after people have paid their respects, but before anyone departs for the reception. Marcus's stomach dropped as the implications registered. James wanted the will read publicly, wanted Victoria and Elena and everyone at Mount Olive Baptist Church to hear about the inheritance simultaneously, wanted the revelation to be as public as the humiliation Marcus had endured earlier. This wasn't just an inheritance. This was theater, carefully choreographed by a dying man who decided his son deserved vindication as public as the contempt he'd suffered. He wants everyone to know, right now. Your father believed transparency would serve you better than secrecy in this particular situation. He felt strongly that certain people needed to understand immediately that circumstances had changed. Those were his exact words. Circumstances had changed. Marcus thought about Victoria's hand on his shoulder, pushing him toward the back of the church. He thought about Diane's emphasis on people who actually mattered. He thought about Elena's silence, her perpetual choice to preserve peace with her mother rather than defend her husband. He thought about standing against the back wall of his father's funeral while strangers occupied the front rows, about the public nature of his humiliation, about how James had witnessed all of it and had responded by turning his death into a stage for Marcus's reversal of fortune. When does this happen? In approximately 10 minutes. I need you to return to the sanctuary. I'll make the announcement after Pastor Williams concludes the service. Your father's instructions were very specific about the timing and the audience. Marcus stood on legs that felt unsteady, the reality of the next 10 minutes pressing down on him like physical weight. In 10 minutes, Victoria would discover that the man she'd spent 8 years treating like garbage had inherited more money than she'd probably seen in her entire life. In 10 minutes, Elena would understand that her silence had cost her more than either of them had realized. In 10 minutes, 200 witnesses to his humiliation would watch the power dynamic shift so dramatically that no one would ever be able to pretend things were the same as they'd been before. He walked back toward the sanctuary with Drake behind him, the hallway stretching longer than it had on the way to the office, each step feeling like walking toward something inevitable and irreversible. The envelope in his pocket pressed against his ribs, James's documentation of 8 years of abuse waiting to be opened, waiting to reveal exactly how carefully his father had been preparing for this moment. The sanctuary was still full, mourners milling around in clusters, conversations humming with a particular energy that emerged when people gathered after death, that mixture of grief and relief and social obligation that turned funerals into strange performances of communal mourning. Marcus found his spot against the back wall, reclaiming the space he'd occupied during the service, and waited for Drake to make his way to the front of the church. Victoria stood near the casket with Elena and her daughters, her posture suggesting ownership of the space, her presence commanding attention from everyone nearby. She caught sight of Drake moving toward the front and frowned, her perfectly maintained composure flickering for just a moment before she smoothed it back into place. She whispered something to Elena, who turned to look at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read from 40 feet away. Something that might have been concern or calculation, or both. Drake reached the pulpit and spoke quietly to Pastor Williams, who nodded and stepped aside, yielding the space to the attorney. Drake adjusted the microphone, tapped it once to ensure it was live, and the sanctuary gradually quieted as people realized something official was about to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but I'm Thurston Drake, and I served as James Reed's attorney for the past 6 years. Mr. Reed left specific instructions that his last will and testament be read aloud at the conclusion of his funeral service, in the presence of all gathered mourners. I'm here to honor that request. The sanctuary went completely silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy and expectant, everyone's attention fixed on Drake as he pulled a document from his briefcase and unfolded it with deliberate care. Marcus watched Victoria's face, saw confusion shift to suspicion, saw her hand tighten on Elena's arm as if anchoring herself to something stable. I, James Theodore Reed, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. I revoke all previous wills and codicils. To my beloved son, Marcus Reed, I leave my entire estate to be distributed as follows. Drake's voice carried across the sanctuary with professional clarity, each word landing with precision. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs, felt the attention of 200 people beginning to shift toward him, felt the weight of what was coming, bearing down like a physical force. The estate consists of the following assets: 23 residential rental properties located throughout the Atlanta metropolitan area, with a combined estimated value of $4.3 million. A diversified investment portfolio consisting of blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, and treasury notes, valued at approximately $6.2 million. The primary residence, located at 2847 Habersham Road in the Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia, valued at $2.3 million. Total estate value, approximately $12.8 million. The number hit the sanctuary like a bomb, the silence shattering into gasps and whispers and shocked exclamations. Marcus watched Victoria's face drain of color, watched Diane's mouth fall open, watched Natalie's hand fly to her chest. Elena turned to stare at him, her eyes wide with disbelief, her carefully controlled expression cracking to reveal something raw and unprocessed underneath. $12.8 million. The words echoed through the sanctuary, repeated in whispers, processed by 200 brains trying to reconcile James Reed, the maintenance supervisor, with James Reed, the multi-millionaire who'd hidden his wealth for 4 decades. Marcus felt frozen, pinned in place by the attention suddenly focused on him, by the collective shock rippling through the crowd, by the magnitude of what his father had just made public. Drake continued reading, his voice steady despite the chaos building in the room. Furthermore, I include the following provision regarding the immediate transfer of inheritance. My son Marcus has endured 8 years of disrespect and contempt from the Hartwell family. He has maintained his dignity, his composure, and his character, despite being treated as less than worthy by people who should have welcomed him as family. Before this inheritance transfers to Marcus, I require the following action from Victoria Hartwell, Diane Hartwell, and Natalie Hartwell. Victoria made a sound like she'd been punched, a sharp intake of breath that carried across the sanctuary. Elena's hand went to her mouth, her eyes locked on Drake as if she could stop what was coming through force of will. Diane grabbed her mother's arm, her face flushed with anger or embarrassment, or both. Natalie had gone pale, her usual smirk replaced by something that looked like genuine fear. These 3 women must publicly acknowledge their treatment of Marcus. They must kneel before him in this sanctuary, in front of all assembled witnesses, and apologize for 8 years of contempt, dismissal, and disrespect. They must do this sincerely and completely. They must acknowledge specific instances of their cruelty and express genuine remorse for their actions. The sanctuary erupted, whispers becoming exclamations, people turning to their neighbors to confirm they'd heard correctly, the social contract of funeral decorum shattering under the weight of this extraordinary demand. Marcus felt like he couldn't breathe, felt his lungs constricting as the implications crashed over him in waves. His father had crafted a provision that required public humiliation as the price of inheritance, had turned Marcus's years of private suffering into a spectacle that would play out in front of everyone who'd witnessed his earlier degradation. If Victoria Hartwell, Diane Hartwell, and Natalie Hartwell refuse this requirement, the entire estate will be donated to the Atlanta Community Foundation to be used for affordable housing initiatives in perpetuity. Marcus Reed will receive nothing. This provision is legally binding and cannot be contested or circumvented. The choice belongs to the Hartwell family. They have 60 seconds to decide, beginning now. Drake pulled out his phone and set a timer, the digital display visible to the first few rows, counting down from 60 seconds with ruthless precision. Marcus watched Victoria's face cycle through emotions faster than he could track, watched her calculate options and weigh consequences, watched her arrive at the impossible choice James had engineered. Apologize publicly, kneel before the man she'd spent 8 years treating like garbage, or condemn Marcus to losing everything his father had built. The cruelty of it hit Marcus with stunning force. His father had tied his inheritance to Victoria's humiliation, had made Marcus's financial future dependent on forcing the Hartwell family to debase themselves. If they refused, Marcus lost $12.8 million. If they complied, they lost something arguably more valuable to people like Victoria: their dignity, their social standing, their ability to maintain the fiction that they were superior to people like Marcus and his father. 50 seconds. 45 seconds. The sanctuary had gone silent again, everyone watching Victoria, waiting to see what she would do, bearing witness to a moment that would get told and retold until it became legend. Victoria's face had hardened, her jaw set, her eyes blazing with fury, and Marcus thought she would refuse, thought his father had finally pushed too hard, thought $12.8 million was about to evaporate because James had overestimated how far greed could bend pride. 30 seconds. 25. Victoria's hand was still locked on Elena's arm, her knuckles white with pressure. Elena was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, her body caught between her mother's rigid fury and her husband's frozen shock. Diane looked like she might be sick, her complexion gone greenish. Natalie had closed her eyes, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or profanity, or both. 15 seconds. 10. Drake's voice cut through the silence with professional neutrality, his tone suggesting this was simply another legal formality rather than social demolition playing out in real time. 10 seconds remaining. The choice must be made. Victoria's eyes found Marcus across the 40 feet separating them, and something passed between them that felt like recognition of the trap James had constructed, like acknowledgement that there was no good choice, only less bad options. At 5 seconds, Victoria released Elena's arm and took a step forward. At 3 seconds, she dropped to her knees on the church carpet, her expensive dress pooling around her, her perfect hair still perfect despite the rest of her world collapsing. Diane followed, then Natalie, the 3 Hartwell women kneeling before Marcus Reed while 200 witnesses watched in stunned silence. The Buckhead Mansion felt like walking into a museum dedicated to someone Marcus had never truly known. He stood in the foyer 48 hours after his father's funeral, keys heavy in his palm, staring at crown molding that probably cost more than every apartment he'd ever rented combined. Thurston Drake had handed him the address along with the keys, had watched Marcus's face register confusion about why his father owned property in one of Atlanta's wealthiest neighborhoods while claiming to live on a modest pension in East Atlanta. The house was immaculate, despite James's death 2 weeks earlier, evidence that someone had been maintaining it regularly. Marcus moved through rooms that spoke of quiet luxury rather than ostentatious wealth. Furniture chosen for comfort and quality rather than status. Art on walls that reflected genuine appreciation rather than investment portfolio diversification. Everything about the space suggested James had lived here, had occupied these rooms daily, had maintained the East Atlanta apartment solely as performance for Marcus's benefit. The realization stung worse than Victoria's funeral humiliation, worse than 8 years of her family's contempt, because this deception came from the person Marcus had trusted most. Every Sunday dinner in that cramped East Atlanta apartment had been theater. Every conversation about budgeting and making ends meet had been carefully constructed fiction. Every moment when Marcus had worried about his father's financial security had been based on lies James had maintained with apparent ease. Marcus found the study on the second floor, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes on real estate investment, economic theory, property management, and financial planning. James's desk dominated the space, its surface clear except for a leather portfolio embossed with Marcus's name. Inside were documents Drake hadn't mentioned, folders organized with the same meticulous care James had brought to everything he touched. The first folder contained property deeds, 23 of them, each marked with purchase date and price. Marcus traced the timeline, watched his father's empire grow from a single duplex purchased in 1985 for $18,000 to a portfolio worth millions. Handwritten notes in margins documented James's strategy. Buy properties other investors overlooked. Do renovation work personally to minimize costs. Keep rents affordable to maintain stable tenants. Reinvest every dollar of profit into the next acquisition. The second folder made Marcus's hands shake as he opened it. Photographs, dozens of them, documenting 8 years of Hartwell family gatherings. Christmas 2019, Marcus standing alone at the edge of a group photo, everyone else clustered together. Thanksgiving 2020, empty chair beside Elena at the dinner table while her family filled every other seat. Easter 2023, Marcus serving food while Victoria's guests ate, treated like hired help at his own wife's family celebration. Someone had been documenting his humiliation systematically, and the realization that it had been his father made Marcus's chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. Anger at the invasion of privacy mixed with gratitude for the validation that his experiences had been real and witnessed, that someone had cared enough to preserve evidence that Marcus hadn't imagined the cruelty or exaggerated its impact. The third folder contained printed emails, correspondence between Victoria and her daughters that James had somehow obtained. Marcus flipped through them, each message another piece of evidence about how the Hartwell family actually viewed him when they thought no one was listening. Victoria to Diane, dated 6 months after the wedding. Elena insists we give Marcus time to prove himself. I maintain he's a phase she'll outgrow once she realizes what she sacrificed by marrying so far beneath her station. We simply must be patient and let her see his inadequacies clearly. Diane to Natalie, dated 3 years ago. Mother's dinner party last night was excruciating. Marcus attempted conversation about his accounting work, as if anyone cares about tax code. Elena looked embarrassed, which gives me hope she's finally seeing what we've known all along. Natalie to Victoria, dated 18 months ago. Do we really have to include Marcus in the family portrait? Can't we just say he was unavailable? I'm tired of explaining to my friends why Elena married someone so obviously wrong for her. Each email landed like a fresh wound, despite Marcus having lived through the experiences they described, despite knowing intellectually that the Hartwell family held him in contempt. Seeing their true feelings documented in writing made the reality inescapable, transformed years of subtle dismissal into concrete evidence of systematic exclusion. The fourth folder contained something Marcus hadn't expected: audio files on a USB drive, each labeled with date and location. He plugged the drive into James's computer, hesitated before clicking the first file, dated from 2 years ago, recorded at what the label identified as Victoria's house during Sunday brunch. Victoria's voice came through the speakers with crystal clarity, her tone carrying that particular blend of warmth and condescension she'd perfected over decades of social positioning. "Elena, darling, you know I only want what's best for you. But have you truly considered what your life will look like in 20 years if you stay married to Marcus? He'll never be more than a mid-level accountant. You'll never have the lifestyle you grew up with, never be able to provide properly for children, never move in circles that matter socially or professionally." Elena's response came quiet, almost inaudible, beneath the clatter of brunch dishes. "He's a good man, Mother. He treats me well. Isn't that what matters?" Victoria's laugh carried sharp edges that cut through the recording. "Good men are plentiful, sweetheart. Good men with prospects are rare. You married goodness without prospects, and I fear you'll regret that choice when you're watching your friends vacation in Europe while you're budgeting for groceries." Marcus stopped the recording, unable to continue listening to his wife defend him so weakly, unable to stomach hearing Victoria dismantle his worth, while Elena offered only token resistance before inevitable capitulation. He scanned the file names, counted 47 recordings spanning 8 years, a comprehensive documentation of every slight, every insult, every moment when the Hartwell family had made their contempt clear, while Marcus maintained his composure. The final item in the leather portfolio was an envelope, this one different from the letter Drake had given him at the funeral, this one marked with James's handwriting that read, "Open alone, after you've seen everything else." Marcus's hands trembled as he broke the seal, pulled out pages covered in his father's familiar script, braced himself for whatever final revelation James had saved for this moment. "Marcus, by now you've seen the house, the properties, the documentation of how Elena's family treated you. You probably feel betrayed that I kept so much hidden. You probably wonder why I let you suffer through 8 years of humiliation instead of revealing my wealth and forcing them to respect you through financial intimidation. Let me explain." The letter detailed James's philosophy about dignity and self-worth, about the difference between respect earned through character and deference bought through resources. James had watched Victoria and her daughters treat Marcus with contempt, had documented every instance, had built a legal case while simultaneously teaching his son that worth existed independent of other people's judgment. I could have intervened at any time, could have shown up at one of their gatherings in expensive clothes, driving a luxury car, making it clear that you came from money and they'd misjudged our family's resources. But that would have taught you the wrong lesson. It would have suggested your worth depended on my bank account, that dignity came from external validation rather than internal strength. James described watching Marcus maintain composure through years of disrespect, seeing his son refuse to beg for acceptance or compromise his values to gain approval from people who'd already decided he was insufficient. Every time Marcus had walked away from an argument, he could have won through escalation. Every time he'd chosen silence over retaliation, Every time he'd preserved his dignity despite Victoria's provocations, James had documented it as evidence that his son possessed the character wealth couldn't purchase. The inheritance isn't just money, Marcus. It's proof. Proof that you built your self-worth on foundation that can't be shaken by other people's opinions. Proof that you maintained dignity when you thought you had nothing, which means you'll maintain it now that you have everything. Proof that patience gets rewarded, that character matters more than comfort, that the kind of strength you demonstrated for 8 years is worth more than any bank balance. The letter concluded with instructions Marcus hadn't anticipated, guidance that transformed the inheritance from passive wealth into active mission. The recordings and documentation aren't weapons for revenge. They're insurance for when the Hartwell family comes after your inheritance, and they will come. Victoria won't accept that the man she deemed unworthy inherited millions while she faces financial ruin. She'll contest the will, claim I was incompetent, hire lawyers to break what I built. When that happens, you'll need proof of who they really are. Evidence that their sudden concern stems from greed rather than legitimate worry about my mental state. Marcus set the letter down and stared at the USB drive, at the folders full of evidence, at the comprehensive documentation James had assembled with the precision of someone preparing for war. His father hadn't just built wealth, he'd built a legal fortress, had anticipated every angle of attack, had provided his son with ammunition to defend against challenges Marcus hadn't known to expect. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena, the first direct communication since the funeral. "We need to talk. Can you come to the house?" The house. Their house. The modest ranch in Grant Park they'd purchased together 6 years ago when combining their incomes had finally made home ownership possible. Marcus had loved that house, had spent weekends painting walls and refinishing floors, had imagined raising children there someday. Now the thought of returning felt like walking back into a cage he'd just escaped. He drove across town anyway, navigating streets he knew by heart, pulling into the driveway beside Elena's Mercedes with its bumper sticker from her law firm. The lawn needed mowing, he noticed, that particular detail hitting with unexpected force, because yard maintenance had been his responsibility, had been part of the domestic division of labor they'd negotiated early in marriage. 2 weeks without him, and already things were sliding into disrepair. Elena opened the door before he could knock, her face showing strain that made her look older than 34, made visible the toll of whatever internal calculation she'd been running since discovering her husband inherited millions while her mother faced foreclosure. She'd been crying, Marcus could tell, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, despite careful application of makeup meant to hide evidence of emotional breakdown. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." Marcus followed her inside, noting changes since he'd last been home 3 days ago. The living room showed signs of her family's presence, Victoria's expensive handbag on the coffee table, Diane's jacket draped over the chair, evidence that the Hartwell women had been staging planning sessions in his absence. The realization that Elena had hosted her family in their home while they strategized about his inheritance made something harden in Marcus's chest, some last vestige of hope for reconciliation calcifying into certainty that their marriage had already ended, that only legal paperwork remained to formalize what emotional reality had already confirmed. "My mother wants to meet with you, with all of us, to discuss the situation and figure out how to move forward as a family." The phrasing was deliberate, Marcus recognized. That careful use of family meant to include him, while simultaneously reminding him of obligations he supposedly owed to people who'd spent 8 years making clear he wasn't truly family at all. Victoria wanted to negotiate, wanted to leverage whatever remained of Marcus's love for Elena into access to inheritance she'd discovered too late to have prevented through prenuptial maneuvering. What situation needs discussing, Elena? My father left me his estate. The will was read publicly, the inheritance transferred legally. What exactly requires family negotiation? Elena's composure cracked slightly, her careful control slipping enough to reveal desperation underneath. Marcus, be reasonable. My mother is facing foreclosure. Diane has massive debt from her divorce. Natalie has no job prospects and no savings. They're family. Your family now, through marriage. Surely you can see that helping them would be the right thing to do. The appeal to obligation landed exactly as Victoria had probably coached, playing on Marcus's demonstrated history of choosing peace over confrontation, assuming 8 years of conflict avoidance meant he'd continue prioritizing family harmony over personal boundaries. But something had shifted in Marcus during the 48 hours since the funeral. Some fundamental recalibration of what he owed to people who'd never extended him basic respect. They're facing consequences of their own choices, Elena. Your mother has 3 mortgages she never should have taken. Diane lived beyond her means for years. Natalie is 29 years old and has never held steady employment because your mother enabled her dependency. None of that is my responsibility to fix. Elena's face flushed, anger breaking through the careful plea for understanding. So you're just going to watch them suffer? Watch my mother lose her house. Watch my sisters struggle. Refuse to help when you have millions you didn't even know existed 2 days ago. The question crystallized everything wrong with their marriage, everything Marcus had tolerated for 8 years while hoping Elena would eventually choose him over her family's demands. She framed his refusal to subsidize their poor decisions as cruelty, recast his boundary setting as selfishness, positioned his inheritance as communal property she had right to distribute according to her family's needs. I'm going to respect your mother's dignity by not treating her like a charity case. I'm going to respect your sister's adulthood by not enabling their continued dependence. And I'm going to respect myself by not letting people who've treated me like garbage for 8 years suddenly claim family connection now that they need money. Elena stepped back as if he'd slapped her, shock evident across features that had never witnessed Marcus draw hard lines or refuse requests framed as family obligation. Is this who you are now? Someone who uses wealth as a weapon? Who punishes people for past mistakes? Who refuses to help family out of spite? The accusation might have landed differently if Marcus hadn't spent the morning reading documentation of exactly how Elena's family viewed him. If he hadn't listened to recordings of Victoria dismissing his worth. If he hadn't seen photographic evidence of systematic exclusion. But armed with James's thorough documentation, Elena's reframing fell flat, revealed itself as manipulation rather than legitimate critique. I'm someone who learned that dignity isn't negotiable, that respect can't be purchased, and that family means something more than financial obligation to people who only acknowledge connection when they need resources. Your mother taught me that lesson thoroughly over 8 years. I'm simply applying her own standards. He pulled the USB drive from his pocket, set it on the coffee table between them like evidence in trial that hadn't started but was inevitably coming. This contains recordings of every conversation where your family discussed me when they thought I couldn't hear. 8 years of documentation about what they actually think of me, of our marriage, of you for choosing me. You should listen to them, particularly the ones where your mother discusses her plans for after your inevitable divorce, where your sisters mock you for wasting your potential on someone beneath your station. You might find them enlightening. Elena stared at the drive like it was explosive, her face cycling through emotions as she processed what Marcus had just revealed. She reached for it tentatively, pulled back, reached again, finally closing her fingers around the small device that contained proof of every suspicion she'd probably harbored but never voiced about her family's true feelings. Marcus, I never knew they... You knew enough, Elena. You heard the comments, saw the exclusion, witnessed them treat me like hired help at family gatherings. You chose to say nothing because speaking up would have cost you their approval, would have forced you to choose between your husband and your mother's comfort. 8 years of choosing silence. 8 years of picking them over me. 8 years of letting them believe their contempt was acceptable because you never once drew a line they couldn't cross. The words came out flat, empty of anger because anger required energy Marcus no longer wanted to spend on fighting battles he'd already lost years ago. Elena was crying now, full body sobs that shook her shoulders. The kind of grief that came from recognizing truth she'd been avoiding through careful self-deception. I'm sorry. God, Marcus, I'm so sorry. I thought if I just gave them time, they'd see what I saw in you. I thought patience would win them over, that eventually they'd accept you and everything would be fine. Marcus thought about his father's letter, about James's observation that patience got rewarded, but required knowing when patience became complicity. Elena had confused waiting for change with enabling abuse, had mistaken silence for peace, had prioritized her mother's comfort over her husband's dignity, while telling herself she was keeping family harmony. Your mother is planning to contest the will. She's already consulted attorneys about claiming my father was mentally incompetent, about arguing I manipulated him into leaving everything to me. She's going to drag our family through court, make public accusations about my character, try to take what my father built through legal warfare. And you'll have to choose, Elena, publicly, on record, whether to support her claims or support your husband. Elena's crying intensified, her body folding in on itself as she processed the impossible choice Victoria was forcing, the reality that her mother's greed would require Elena to pick sides in ways she'd avoided for 8 years. I don't know how to... Then figure it out. Because this time, staying silent means choosing them. This time, refusing to take a stand is taking a stand. And when you do choose, know that I'll have 8 years of documentation about who your family really is, about what they actually think of both of us, about the contempt they've hidden behind polite smiles and family obligation. Marcus left the USB drive on the coffee table and walked toward the door, done with the conversation. Done with watching Elena struggle with choices she should have made years ago. She called after him, her voice desperate and breaking, but he didn't turn around, didn't offer comfort or reassurance or false hope that their marriage might survive what was coming. He drove back to the Buckhead house, let himself into a space that felt more like home after 3 hours than the Grant Park house had felt after 6 years of mortgage payments. Rebecca Montgomery called as he pulled into the driveway, her voice carrying professional concern that suggested news he wouldn't want to hear. Marcus, Victoria Hartwell retained Bradford Kensington's firm this afternoon. They filed a petition to contest your father's will about an hour ago. Claims of mental incompetence, undue influence, and emotional manipulation. They're asking the court to invalidate the entire estate distribution and force division among family members.
Marcus had expected this. James's letter had warned him explicitly, but hearing it confirmed still sent cold dread through his stomach. Legal warfare meant public spectacle, meant months of testimony and cross-examination, meant watching lawyers dissect his relationship with his father while Victoria's attorneys tried to paint James as incompetent and Marcus as manipulative. What do we need to do? Rebecca's voice carried calm authority that suggested she'd been through this before, understood how to navigate contests driven by greed rather than legitimate concern. First, we get a continuance to prepare our defense. Second, we depose everyone involved to lock in their stories before they coordinate better lies. Third, we prepare to present the evidence your father collected.
The medical records showing his cognitive function, the documented history of his real estate strategy, and the recordings that prove the Hartwell family's actual motivation for contesting. The recordings where they discuss me? Those are admissible? Georgia is a one-party consent state for recording. If your father was present during the conversations, he had every legal right to record them. And they are absolutely admissible to demonstrate the real motivation behind this contest, to show that Victoria's sudden concern about James's mental state correlates perfectly with her discovering she's facing foreclosure, while you inherited millions. Marcus thought about Elena listening to the recordings, about her hearing Victoria's plans for after the divorce, about whether that evidence would be enough to make her choose differently when the legal battle forced her hand. Some part of him still hoped she'd surprise him, still wanted to believe 8 years of marriage meant something more than convenience and her family's conditional approval. When does this get ugly? Rebecca's laugh carried dark humor that suggested she knew exactly how ugly estate contests could become. It's already ugly, Marcus. It gets brutal during depositions when I start asking Victoria about her financial situation, her history of living beyond her means, her documented statements about you and your father. It gets devastating when I play the recordings in court and 200 people who witnessed your humiliation at the funeral get to hear Victoria's own words about her actual motivations. 3 weeks passed in blur of legal preparation, Marcus spending hours with Rebecca going through documentation, organizing evidence, preparing for depositions that would force him to relive 8 years of accumulated slights, while lawyers took notes. The house in Grant Park sold quickly, Marcus signing papers that dissolved that particular tie to Elena without contest or negotiation. She could have the proceeds, could use them however she wanted, could give every penny to her mother if that's what family obligation demanded. The deposition started with Diane, her attorney present, but clearly outmatched by Rebecca's surgical approach to questioning. Rebecca walked Diane through her financial history, established the pattern of debt and poor decisions, then pulled up emails Diane had sent about Marcus over the years. Each message another piece of evidence that the Hartwell family's contest stemmed from greed rather than concern for James's competence. Ms. Hartwell, I'm showing you an email you sent to your mother dated 3 years ago. Can you read the highlighted portion for the record? Diane's face flushed as she scanned the email, her voice reluctant as she read her own words aloud. Marcus is terminally mediocre. I don't understand what Elena sees in him beyond misguided loyalty to a youthful mistake. The sooner she realizes she married wrong, the sooner we can all move past this embarrassment. Rebecca let the words hang in the air before continuing, her tone remaining professionally neutral despite the devastating impact of Diane's own contempt documented in writing. Would you say this email reflects concern for James Reed's well-being, or does it perhaps suggest different motivations for your current legal action? Diane's attorney objected, claimed the question was argumentative, but the damage was done. Rebecca had established pattern, had shown that Diane's contempt for Marcus predated any concern about James's mental state, had built foundation for argument that the entire contest was bad faith litigation motivated by financial desperation rather than legitimate worry about competency. Natalie's deposition went differently, her demeanor less hostile than her sister's, her answers carrying hesitation that suggested internal conflict about the legal strategy Victoria had chosen. Rebecca pushed gently, sensing weakness, building toward revelation that would crack the Hartwell family's united front. Miss Hartwell, You provided certain recordings to my office 3 weeks ago. Can you explain what motivated that decision? Natalie's attorney leaned over to whisper, probably advising her to refuse answering. But Natalie shook her head and spoke directly to Rebecca with surprising directness. I provided recordings of my mother's strategy sessions with her attorney because what she was planning was wrong. Marcus never did anything to deserve 8 years of contempt from our family. My father left him money, which was his right. Trying to steal that inheritance through claims we all know are false is immoral. And I won't be part of it. The statement detonated whatever remained of the Hartwell family's coordinated defense, established that at least one daughter recognized the contest as illegitimate, provided testimony that would undermine Victoria's claims about family unity and legitimate concern. Rebecca thanked Natalie and ended the deposition, the damage to Victoria's case already catastrophic before they'd even reached the matriarch herself. Victoria's deposition was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, the conference room at Kensington's firm designed to intimidate with its mahogany furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown Atlanta. Victoria arrived in expensive clothes that probably represented her last remaining assets, her composure carefully maintained despite the financial pressure she faced with foreclosure proceedings advancing and no inheritance materializing to save her. Rebecca spent the first hour establishing Victoria's financial history, documenting the mortgages and credit cards and lifestyle maintenance that had consumed income without building equity. Then she shifted to Victoria's relationship with James, walking through the documented evidence that Victoria had avoided him, had discouraged Elena from maintaining connection, had actively excluded him from family events whenever possible. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm going to play audio from a recording made in your home approximately 18 months ago. Please listen carefully and confirm whether that's your voice. The recording played through speakers in the conference room, Victoria's voice unmistakable as she spoke to Diane about Marcus and James, about her plans for after Elena's inevitable divorce, about her expectation that cutting ties would be easy once Elena came to her senses. Marcus watched Victoria's face drain of color as she heard her own words, watched her realize that James had documented everything, that her contempt had been preserved on devices she'd never known existed. That's your voice, correct, Mrs. Hartwell? Victoria's response came barely above whisper, her composure finally cracking under the weight of hearing her own cruelty played back in legal proceeding. Yes, that's me. Rebecca played 3 more recordings, each one more damaging than the last, building comprehensive picture of Victoria's actual feelings about James and Marcus, her strategic planning for estate access, her complete lack of genuine concern for James's well-being beyond what his potential assets might provide. By the final recording, Victoria sat with her face in her hands, Kensington beside her looking like he wanted to be anywhere else, the deposition record establishing beyond question that the contest stemmed from greed rather than concern. One final question, Mrs. Hartwell. In your petition, you claim Marcus exerted undue influence over his father. Can you provide any specific example of Marcus manipulating James Reed into any decision, financial or otherwise, during the 8 years of your acquaintance? Victoria's hands dropped from her face, her eyes meeting Marcus's across the conference table with something that might have been recognition of complete defeat. No, I cannot provide examples because there are none. Marcus never manipulated James. James made his own decisions, and one of those decisions was giving everything to his son instead of helping my family. That's not manipulation. That's just unfair. The admission hung in the air like confession extracted under torture, Victoria's own words destroying whatever remained of her legal case. Rebecca concluded the deposition, gathered her materials, and gestured for Marcus to follow her out of the conference room. In the elevator descending to street level, she finally allowed herself a small smile of professional satisfaction. That's effectively over. When we get to court, Judge Coleman will hear those depositions, will see the recordings, will recognize this entire contest as abuse of legal process. Your father's will is going to be validated, and Victoria is going to face consequences for perjury and bad faith litigation. Marcus nodded, feeling exhaustion settle into his bones, despite the victory Rebecca had just engineered. Winning felt hollow somehow. Vindication, insufficient compensation for 8 years of accumulated humiliation. Legal triumph not erasing the reality that his marriage had been built on foundation too weak to support weight of actual challenge. Elena called that evening, her voice carrying defeat that matched what Marcus felt, despite their opposing positions in the legal warfare. I listened to the recordings. All of them. Every conversation where my mother discussed you, discussed us, discussed her plans for after I divorced you. Marcus, I don't know what to say. Marcus waited, unwilling to offer comfort or reassurance, done with making it easier for Elena to avoid confronting what her silence had cost them both. I'm not going to support the contest. I'm going to file a statement with the court that I believe your father was competent, that the will reflects his true wishes, that my mother's lawsuit is without merit. My attorney says it will help your case significantly. The gesture came too late to matter, Marcus recognized. Elena's courage appearing only after complete defeat was inevitable. Her willingness to oppose her mother emerging only when opposition cost her nothing, because the case was already lost. But he appreciated it anyway. Appreciated that she'd found some backbone, even if timing rendered it meaningless. Thank you. That will help, yes. Silence stretched between them. 8 years of marriage and accumulated resentment making conversation awkward, despite having shared life together, despite once having believed they'd grow old together in that Grant Park house. I'm filing for divorce too. My attorney says the prenup makes it straightforward. You keep the inheritance, I keep my separate property. We split nothing because there's nothing joint to split. We can be done in 60 days if you don't contest. Marcus felt something release in his chest, some tension he'd been carrying since the funeral finally relaxing as Elena confirmed what he'd already known but hadn't wanted to initiate himself. I won't contest. Sign whatever papers your attorney prepares. We can end this cleanly. I'm sorry, Marcus, for everything, for not being brave enough to choose you, for letting them treat you the way they did, for being the kind of wife who valued her mother's approval more than her husband's dignity. You deserved better than what I gave you. The apology sounded genuine, carried weight of real remorse rather than strategic positioning, but it changed nothing about past or future. Sorry didn't give Marcus back 8 years. Sorry didn't transform Elena into someone capable of standing up to her family. Sorry was just a word people said when consequences arrived and they finally recognized how badly they'd fucked up. I hope you figure out who you want to be, Elena. Without your mother's voice in your head, without the constant pressure to maintain appearances, without worrying about what your family thinks, you might surprise yourself. He ended the call before she could respond, done with conversations that circled around pain without ever quite landing on resolution. The house felt empty, despite being filled with his father's possessions, despite technically containing more square footage than anywhere Marcus had lived before. Empty in the way places feel when you're alone, not by choice, but by circumstance. When solitude results from losses accumulated rather than actively chosen. 6 months would pass before Rebecca called with the envelope James had left. 6 months of Marcus managing properties and reviewing investment statements and learning to be wealthy without any of the generational knowledge that usually came with significant resources. 6 months of discovering that money solved some problems while creating others, that wealth attracted people whose interest correlated suspiciously with account balances, that his father had been right about inheritance, revealing who people really were when stakes got raised. But all of that lay ahead, still invisible on the horizon, as Marcus sat in James's study, reading documentation of 8 years of humiliation, holding evidence that would destroy the Hartwell family's legal case, processing the reality that his father had spent his final years building fortress to protect a son who'd never known he needed protecting. The letter on the desk remained open to James's final paragraph, words Marcus read again as evening light faded through windows overlooking Buckhead's tree-lined streets. The money is yours. The properties are yours. The future is yours, to build however you see fit. But more than any of that, son, I'm leaving you the knowledge that you maintained your dignity when you thought you had nothing. That's the inheritance that matters. The wealth that can't be taken away. The foundation on which everything else either stands or crumbles. Use it well. Make me proud. And remember that patience always gets rewarded, sometimes in ways you never expect. Marcus folded the letter carefully, returned it to the portfolio, and walked to the window to watch night settle over Atlanta. Somewhere across town, Victoria was probably meeting with her attorney. Diane was facing her debts. Natalie was figuring out how to build a life independent of her mother's enabling. Somewhere in Virginia Highland, Elena was listening to recordings that proved everything Marcus had endured while she'd stayed silent. And here in Buckhead, in a house that felt more like mausoleum than home, Marcus stood surrounded by his father's legacy and tried to figure out what came next, how to transform inheritance into purpose, how to become the kind of man who wielded wealth without letting it corrupt what James had built into his character through 35 years of quiet example. The answer would come in 6 months, would arrive in a sealed envelope containing his father's final instructions, would transform passive management into active mission. But for now, Marcus simply stood at the window and mourned, grieving not just for his father, but for the marriage that had ended, for the 8 years spent hoping Elena would choose him, for the man he'd been before inheritance had changed everything, while simultaneously proving his father's point that some things couldn't be changed by any amount of money. Dignity, patience, character, worth. The words echoed through his mind like catechism, like foundation on which everything else had to be built, or nothing else would matter. James had left him millions, but more importantly, James had left him proof that he'd earned every dollar through maintaining composure when others would have crumbled, through preserving dignity when dignity was the only thing he had left to preserve, through being the kind of man whose character couldn't be purchased because it had been forged in fire rather than inherited through accident of birth. That was the real inheritance. Everything else was just numbers in accounts, deeds to properties, shares of stock that rose and fell based on market forces beyond anyone's control. But character, dignity, patience, worth, those were the assets that mattered, the wealth that compounded across generations, the legacy that lasted long after bank balances had been spent and properties had changed hands and money had flowed to wherever money eventually flowed. Marcus understood that now, standing in his father's house, holding his father's documentation, preparing for the legal battle that would vindicate everything James had known and taught and preserved through years of careful planning. The inheritance was secure, the evidence was overwhelming, and the future lay open like blank page waiting to be written. He just had to figure out what story he wanted to tell. What purpose would justify the resources James had accumulated? What mission would transform money into meaning? That answer would come, Marcus trusted, because James had prepared him for this moment as thoroughly as he'd prepared legal defenses and documented evidence and built wealth that would survive beyond his own life. For now, Marcus simply stood at the window and waited for clarity, patient in the way his father had taught him to be patient, trusting that rewards came to those who maintained dignity through uncertainty, confident that the foundation James had built into his character would prove more valuable than any amount of money when the real work finally began. The Fulton County Courthouse smelled like old wood and anxiety, that particular combination of cleaning solution and nervous sweat that permeated every government building where people's futures got decided by strangers in black robes. Marcus sat at the defendant's table beside Rebecca Montgomery, his hands folded on the polished surface, his posture straight, despite 60 days of legal warfare that had drained his bank account and tested every lesson James had taught him about patience and dignity. Across the aisle, Victoria Hartwell's attorney shuffled papers with the confidence of someone who believed they held winning cards, who thought superior resources and social connections trumped evidence and truth. Judge Patricia Coleman entered through the side door, her gray hair pulled back in a style that suggested she had no time for vanity or pretense, her face carrying the kind of weathered authority that came from 3 decades of sorting truth from performance. Everyone rose, the rustle of clothing and scrape of chairs filling the courtroom, until she took her seat and gestured for them to follow suit. The bailiff called the case, his voice echoing off high ceilings that had witnessed countless families torn apart by greed disguised as principle. Hartwell versus Reed, estate contest and motion to invalidate will. Counsel, are we ready to proceed? Victoria's attorney stood, a man named Bradford Kensington, whose firm occupied the top 3 floors of a midtown tower and charged hourly rates that could fund a family's groceries for a month. His suit probably cost more than Marcus earned in 2 months as an accountant, and he carried himself with the particular arrogance of people who'd never lost often enough to learn humility. Your Honor, we are ready. The petitioners seek to invalidate the will of James Theodore Reed on grounds of mental incompetence and undue influence. We have substantial evidence that Mr. Reed suffered from dementia in his final months, and that his son Marcus Reed exploited that condition to manipulate the distribution of assets. Rebecca rose, her movements economical, her voice carrying quiet authority that needed no volume to command attention. Your Honor, the respondent is prepared to demonstrate that James Reed possessed full mental capacity until his death, that his will reflects careful planning executed over 6 years with consistent legal counsel, and that the petitioner's claims stem entirely from their disappointment at being excluded from an inheritance they never had right to expect. Judge Coleman's expression suggested she'd heard this particular song before, understood the rhythm of family members suddenly concerned about mental competence when money got distributed in ways they disliked. She nodded to Kensington, granting him permission to present his case, and Marcus settled in for what Rebecca had warned would be a long morning of watching people who treated him like garbage try to paint his father as incompetent. Kensington called his first witness, a psychiatrist named Dr. Gerald Mitchum, who specialized in geriatric mental health and had never actually examined James Reed. The doctor took the stand with professorial confidence, his credentials impressive enough to intimidate anyone unfamiliar with how expert testimony could be purchased by whichever side paid the retainer. Kensington walked him through an analysis based entirely on medical records subpoenaed from Grady Memorial, pointing to notes about confusion during James's final hospitalization, about moments of disorientation that Mitchum claimed indicated cognitive decline consistent with dementia. Based on these records, Doctor, would you say James Reed possessed the mental capacity to execute a complex will in his final months? Mitchum adjusted his glasses, a gesture that probably played well to juries who confused theatrical gravitas with actual expertise. In my professional opinion, The documented confusion and disorientation suggest Mr. Reed was experiencing cognitive impairment that would have affected his judgment and decision-making capabilities. The will's unusual provisions, particularly the requirement that family members kneel and apologize, indicate emotional instability rather than rational planning. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, felt Rebecca's hand briefly touch his arm in warning not to react visibly, not to give Kensington ammunition by appearing defensive or angry. But hearing his father's carefully constructed justice dismissed as emotional instability, hearing James's final act of protecting his son characterized as evidence of mental decline, cut deeper than any of Victoria's insults had managed during 8 years of marriage. Rebecca stood for cross-examination, her approach surgical rather than theatrical, her questions designed to expose weakness rather than create spectacle. Dr. Mitchum, you never personally examined James Reed, correct? That's correct. I'm basing my opinion on medical records and accepted diagnostic criteria. These medical records document Mr. Reed's final 2 weeks of life, when he was hospitalized with severe pneumonia and sepsis. Is that accurate? Yes, the records span his final hospitalization. Doctor, in your professional experience, is it common for patients with severe infections and high fevers to experience temporary confusion? Mitchum shifted slightly, his confidence flickering as he recognized the trap being constructed around him. Delirium from infection can cause temporary confusion, yes. And would such infection-induced confusion indicate underlying dementia, or would it represent a temporary condition that resolves when the infection is treated? It depends on the specific circumstances. In this case, the pattern of confusion suggests more than simple delirium. Rebecca pulled a document from the folder in front of her, approaching the witness stand with the kind of calm precision that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment since the case began. I'm showing you what's been marked as Defendant's Exhibit A, Dr. Mitchum. This is a cognitive assessment performed on James Reed 6 weeks before his death by Dr. Sarah Chen at Emory Memory Center. Can you read the conclusion for the court? Mitchum's face lost some of its professional certainty as he scanned the document, his eyes finding the section Rebecca had indicated, his voice losing volume as he read aloud. Patient demonstrates normal cognitive function across all tested domains, memory, reasoning, and executive function, all within expected range for age. No indicators of dementia or significant cognitive impairment observed. 6 weeks before his death, doctor. 6 weeks before he executed the will you claim demonstrates mental incompetence. How do you reconcile your opinion with this assessment by a board-certified neurologist specializing in memory disorders? Mitchum's answer came slower, more hedged, the confident expert replaced by someone scrambling to maintain credibility under assault. One assessment doesn't rule out cognitive decline. Dementia can progress rapidly. From normal function to incompetence in 6 weeks, doctor? While maintaining the ability to manage a complex real estate portfolio, execute detailed financial transactions, and articulate specific legal provisions to his attorney? That seems rather remarkable. Kensington objected, claimed Rebecca was arguing rather than questioning, but Judge Coleman overruled him with a gesture that suggested she'd heard enough from Dr. Mitchum and his purchased expertise. Rebecca returned to her seat, and Marcus watched Victoria's face from across the aisle, saw calculation replacing the confidence that had carried her through the first hour of testimony. The cracks were showing, the foundation of her case crumbling under the weight of actual evidence rather than convenient narrative. Kensington called Victoria next, his strategy apparently shifting to character assassination since medical competence wasn't producing the results he needed. She took the stand with the composure of someone accustomed to commanding rooms, her black dress expensive but appropriately somber, her demeanor suggesting wounded dignity rather than calculated greed. Kensington led her through a narrative designed to paint Marcus as manipulative, as someone who'd isolated James from his daughter-in-law's family, who'd poisoned the relationship between father and son's wife, who'd positioned himself to inherit by driving wedges between people who should have been united. Mrs. Hartwell, can you describe your relationship with James Reed before his death? Victoria's voice carried just the right note of sadness, that practiced tone that suggested genuine emotion to anyone who didn't know her capacity for performance. We had a cordial relationship, though Marcus made it difficult. He was very protective of his father, often excluding us from family events, making it clear we weren't welcome in James's life. I tried to maintain connection, but Marcus controlled access. The lie landed smooth as silk, and Marcus felt his hands ball into fists beneath the table, felt Rebecca's subtle pressure on his ankle, warning him to maintain composure, to trust that truth would emerge through evidence rather than emotional reaction. Victoria continued, spinning 8 years of her contempt into a story where she'd been the victim of Marcus's controlling behavior, where every slight had originated with him rather than reflecting her own casual cruelty. And the will's provisions requiring you and your daughters to kneel and apologize? How did you interpret that requirement? It felt like Marcus's revenge, like he'd manipulated his father into humiliating us publicly, into forcing us to debase ourselves before receiving what should have been a straightforward inheritance. It showed James wasn't thinking clearly, that Marcus had poisoned his mind against us. Rebecca rose for cross-examination, and Marcus saw something in her expression that suggested Victoria had miscalculated, had overplayed her hand, had forgotten that careful lawyers documented everything before allowing testimony to proceed. Rebecca held a small USB drive, the same drive James had given Marcus before his death, the same drive Marcus had turned over to Rebecca during their first strategy session. Mrs. Hartwell, you testified that Marcus controlled access to James Reed and excluded your family from his life. Is that accurate? Yes, that's what I said. So you're testifying under oath that Marcus prevented you from having relationship with James? That's correct. He made it very difficult. Rebecca inserted the USB drive into her laptop, connected it to the courtroom's display system, and pulled up a file dated 3 years earlier. Audio began playing, Victoria's voice clear and distinctive as she spoke to someone identified in the file metadata as her sister Margaret. I wouldn't visit James if you paid me, Margaret. The man lives in that tiny apartment like some kind of hermit. Elena keeps suggesting we include him in family events, but honestly, what would we talk about? He fixes toilets for a living. We have nothing in common. The courtroom went silent, except for Victoria's recorded voice continuing through observations about James's lack of sophistication, his boring conversation, his unsuitability as a connection point for the Hartwell family. Marcus watched Victoria's face drain of color, watched her realize that James's documentation had been more thorough than she'd imagined, watched her understand that every calculated lie was about to be demolished by her own words. Vosé stopped the recording and pulled up another file, this one dated 18 months ago. Victoria speaking to Diane about Marcus and James, in terms that made earlier contempt sound generous by comparison. We need to maintain minimal contact until Elena comes to her senses. Once she divorces Marcus, we can cut ties completely. James is irrelevant except as leverage if Marcus tries to get difficult about the settlement. The second recording ended, and Rebecca pulled up a third, then a fourth, building a montage of Victoria's actual feelings about James and Marcus, her own voice destroying every claim she'd made about cordial relationships and excluded access. By the fifth recording, Kensington was objecting strenuously, claiming the recordings violated privacy laws, claiming they'd been obtained illegally, claiming anything he could think of to stop the hemorrhaging of his client's credibility. Judge Coleman examined the authentication documentation Rebecca provided, verified that James had recorded conversations in his own home with at least one party's consent, confirmed that George's single-party consent law made the recordings legally admissible, and overruled Kensington's objections with an expression that suggested her patience for this contest was approaching its limit. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you lie to this court when you testified about your relationship with James Reed and Marcus's supposed control over access?" Victoria's composure finally cracked completely, her carefully maintained dignity shattering under the weight of being confronted with her own documented contempt. Her voice came out small, defeated, nothing like the confident testimony she'd delivered 15 minutes earlier. "I may have mischaracterized certain aspects of the situation." Rebecca played one final recording, this one dated 8 days after James's funeral. Victoria speaking to her attorney about strategy for contesting the will. Her voice carried through the courtroom with devastating clarity, each word another nail in the coffin of her case. "We need to break that will before Marcus realizes what he has. The apology was humiliating, but it's not binding for anything beyond the initial transfer. Once we get the estate into probate court, we can claim undue influence, get the whole thing invalidated, and force a settlement. Marcus won't have resources to fight a prolonged legal battle. We'll bleed him dry with legal fees until he accepts whatever we offer." The strategy she'd just articulated, the plan she'd been executing for 60 days, laid bare in her own words, recorded by her own attorney during what she'd assumed was privileged consultation. Except the recording hadn't come from her attorney, had come from somewhere else, some source Marcus didn't recognize, until Rebecca introduced it into evidence as having been provided by Natalie Hartwell, who'd recorded her mother without permission and turned it over to Marcus's legal team 3 weeks into the contest. Marcus turned to see Natalie sitting in the gallery, her face pale but determined, her presence in the courtroom a betrayal of her mother that must have cost her everything within the Hartwell family structure. She met his eyes and nodded once, a gesture that carried apology and solidarity and recognition that some lines shouldn't be crossed, even by family. That what Victoria had planned went beyond acceptable bounds of legal maneuvering into territory that required opposition, regardless of blood ties. Judge Coleman's voice cut through the courtroom's stunned silence with judicial authority that left no room for argument or appeal. "I've heard enough. Mr. Kensington, your client has committed perjury in my courtroom, has demonstrated through her own recorded admissions that this contest stems entirely from greed rather than legitimate concern about mental competence, and has revealed a conspiracy to abuse the legal system for financial gain. I'm dismissing this case with prejudice. The will of James Theodore Reed is hereby validated and confirmed. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for potential prosecution for perjury and abuse of process. We're adjourned." The gavel came down with finality that echoed through the courtroom, through Marcus's chest, through the 60 days of legal warfare that had drained him emotionally and financially, despite Rebecca's willingness to work on contingency. Victoria sat frozen at the defense table, Kensington gathering papers with hands that shook slightly, the reality of complete defeat settling over them like fog. Diane had her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Only Natalie maintained composure, standing to leave the gallery with her head high, despite knowing she'd just severed connection with her mother and sister in ways that might never heal. Rebecca touched Marcus's shoulder, her voice quiet but carrying satisfaction at a job thoroughly executed. "It's over. The inheritance is secure. Everything your father built is legally and irrevocably yours." Marcus nodded, unable to find words for the tangle of emotions coursing through him. Relief at the case ending, vindication at seeing Victoria's lies exposed, exhaustion from 60 days of constant stress. And underneath it all, grief at what his marriage had become. at the reality that Elena had watched her family try to destroy him and had chosen their side, even when choosing meant supporting perjury and legal abuse. He stood, gathering the folders Rebecca handed him, preparing to leave the courtroom and begin figuring out what came next. Elena waited in the hallway outside, her presence unexpected enough that Marcus almost walked past her before registering she was there. She looked diminished somehow, smaller than he remembered, her expensive clothes hanging on a frame that had lost weight. Dark circles under her eyes, suggesting sleep had become difficult in recent weeks. "Can we talk? Please? Just 5 minutes?" Marcus glanced at Rebecca, who nodded and moved down the hallway to give them space, though she remained visible in case this conversation turned hostile or manipulative. He leaned against the marble wall, suddenly too tired to maintain the rigid posture he'd held through 2 hours of testimony and cross-examination, too drained to perform strength when everything inside him felt fragile. "What do you want, Elena?" She flinched at the flatness in his voice, at the absence of warmth that had once defined their interactions before 8 years of her silence had burned through whatever affection had existed between them. "I wanted to apologize. For everything. For not defending you. For choosing them over you. For letting this go as far as it did." The words sounded rehearsed, practiced in mirrors or therapy sessions, or late-night conversations with whatever remained of her support system after Natalie's betrayal had fractured the Hartwell family unity. Marcus studied her face, looking for genuine remorse beneath the performance, searching for some indication that she understood the magnitude of what she had enabled through 8 years of strategic silence. "You watched your mother commit perjury. You sat in that courtroom knowing she was lying, knowing Kensington was building a case on fabricated evidence, and you said nothing. At what point, Elena, were you planning to grow a conscience?" Her eyes filled with tears, real ones that spilled over and tracked mascara down her cheeks, and Marcus felt nothing except faint curiosity about whether the crying was genuine emotion or calculated manipulation designed to extract sympathy she hadn't earned. "I know. I know I failed you. Every single day for 8 years I failed you. I told myself I was keeping peace, maintaining family harmony, that eventually they'd see what I saw in you. But that was just cowardice dressed up as strategy. I was weak. I am weak. And I'm sorry." "You're sorry now. After your mother's case collapsed. After the inheritance is secure. After there's nothing left for you to gain by supporting her lies. Convenient timing for your conscience to activate." Elena's face crumpled, her composure shattering completely, her body folding in on itself as she slid down the marble wall to sit on the polished floor of the courthouse hallway. She wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself small, and Marcus recognized the gesture from early in their relationship, when Elena would curl up exactly like this after difficult days at work, when she'd sought comfort in physical vulnerability. He'd held her then, had provided reassurance and support, and the kind of unconditional acceptance she'd never extended to him when roles reversed. "I lost myself somewhere in trying to please everyone. I became someone I don't recognize. Someone who values my mother's approval more than my husband's dignity. Someone who watches injustice happen and stays silent because speaking up costs too much. I don't know how to be the person you needed me to be." Marcus slid down the wall to sit beside her, maintaining distance between them, close enough for conversation, but far enough that their bodies didn't touch. The hallway was empty except for Rebecca at the far end, the courthouse quiet during the lunch recess, their conversation happening in a bubble of privacy, unusual in a building designed for public proceedings. "You don't know how to be brave, Elena. That's what you're saying. After 8 years of marriage, after watching your family treat me like garbage, after standing by while your mother tried to steal my inheritance through perjury. You still don't know how to choose integrity over approval. What exactly would it take? What line would they have to cross before you found the courage to say no?" She had no answer. Her silence confirmation that there might not be a line, that her need for her mother's approval ran deeper than any commitment she'd made to Marcus on their wedding day. They sat together in the empty hallway, two people who'd promised to build a life together, sitting amid the ruins of that promise, sorting through debris to see if anything remained worth salvaging. "I filed divorce papers 3 days ago. My attorney will serve them tomorrow. You can keep the house, Elena. I don't need it. The prenup your mother insisted on means everything else stays separate, so there's nothing to contest. We can end this cleanly, quickly, without more lawyers and more courtrooms and more public spectacles." Elena's breath hitched, though she couldn't have been surprised by this outcome. Couldn't have imagined their marriage would survive her mother's legal assault and her own complicity in enabling it. "If I choose you now, if I stand up to them and cut ties and commit to us instead of them, would you take me back? Could you forgive me?" Marcus thought about the question, genuinely considered whether forgiveness was possible after everything that had happened, whether love could survive 8 years of accumulated resentment and the particular betrayal of watching your spouse enable your destruction. "I spent 8 years waiting for you to choose me, Elena. 8 years hoping the next time would be different, that the next family gathering would be the one where you'd finally defend me, that the next insult would be the last one you'd let slide. I built my entire marriage around waiting for you to be brave, and you never were." He stood, his knees protesting the movement after sitting on cold marble, his body carrying exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. "I don't want someone who needs an inheritance and a court case and her family's complete destruction to finally find the courage to respect me. I want someone who chose me from the beginning, who defended me when it cost her something, who valued our partnership over her mother's approval. You're not that person. You might become that person someday, but I can't wait anymore to find out." He walked away without looking back, found Rebecca waiting at the end of the hallway with her briefcase and her professional composure and her complete absence of judgment about the complicated emotional landscape Marcus was navigating. They left the courthouse together, emerged into Atlanta sunshine that felt too bright after 2 hours in Judge Coleman's courtroom, and Marcus realized he had no idea what came next, what a man did with $12.8 million and a marriage ending and a father's legacy that felt more like a burden than a gift. 6 months dissolved into routine faster than Marcus expected, each day bleeding into the next as he navigated the practical realities of managing an inheritance that demanded constant attention despite his complete lack of experience with real estate portfolios and investment strategies. He hired a property management company recommended by Rebecca to handle the 23 rental units James had accumulated, hired a financial advisor to manage the investment portfolio, hired an accountant to navigate the tax implications of suddenly becoming wealthy without any of the generational knowledge that usually accompanied significant net worth. The Buckhead house remained empty, except for Marcus's weekly visits to sort through James's belongings, to catalog the life his father had lived in secret while maintaining the fiction of modest retirement. Each room revealed new layers of who James had been beyond the maintenance supervisor persona. Walls lined with books about economic theory and real estate investment. Filing cabinets containing meticulous records of every property purchase and renovation. Photo albums showing properties at acquisition and after. James's personal improvement work transformed them into assets worth significantly more than their purchase price. Marcus found himself spending afternoons in his father's study, reading through journals that documented not just financial strategy, but philosophy. James's thoughts about wealth and dignity and the responsibility that came with having resources when others struggled. One entry, dated 4 years earlier, hit with particular force as Marcus sat surrounded by evidence of careful planning. Watched Victoria insult Marcus to his face at Easter dinner today. Elena said nothing, again. Marcus maintained his composure, again. I wanted to intervene, to show them the bank statements that prove their contempt is directed at someone worth more than their entire family combined. But that would rob Marcus of the chance to know his own worth separate from money. The inheritance I'm building isn't just financial. It's the gift of understanding that dignity doesn't come from what you own, but from who you are when you think you have nothing. When he finally inherits, he'll know which came first. Marcus set the journal down, vision blurring with tears he'd been holding back since the funeral, since the will reading, since the moment he'd realized his father had orchestrated everything with surgical precision aimed at teaching lessons Marcus was only beginning to understand. James hadn't just left money. He'd left proof that Marcus's worth existed independent of other people's judgment, that 8 years of maintaining composure under assault had been its own kind of wealth accumulation, that patience truly did get rewarded in ways nobody expected. The divorce finalized with minimal drama, Elena signing papers without contest, accepting the house and her separate assets, and walking away from Marcus's inheritance without fight or protest. He'd heard through Natalie, who'd maintained contact despite her family's freezing her out after her courtroom betrayal, that Elena had moved into a modest apartment in Virginia Highland, had started therapy, had begun building a life separate from her mother's influence for the first time in 34 years. Whether that transformation would stick remained unclear, but Marcus found he no longer had energy to care about Elena's journey toward becoming whoever she'd been before Victoria's expectations had shaped her into someone willing to tolerate injustice for the sake of family peace. Victoria had lost her house to foreclosure 3 months after the trial. The legal fees from her failed contest, combined with decades of living beyond her means, finally collapsing into bankruptcy that stripped away the carefully maintained facade of upper-class stability. She'd moved into a small apartment in Decatur, had taken part-time work at a nonprofit that helped low-income families navigate housing resources. And Marcus had heard through Natalie that the job was humbling Victoria in ways no court ruling could have achieved. She spent her days helping people she'd once dismissed as beneath her, learning that dignity didn't correlate with income, discovering that the working-class families she assisted possessed strength and grace that her own family had lacked, despite their supposed superiority. Diane worked retail at Lenox Square, selling designer clothes to women who reminded her of who she used to be. Her bitterness about the fall from grace evident in every interaction Natalie reported. She'd declared personal bankruptcy, had moved in with a roommate to split rent, had lost the veneer of sophistication that came from having money to mask character defects. Natalie had enrolled at Georgia State, pursuing a social work degree funded partly by student loans and partly by a small trust fund that had survived her mother's financial collapse, her decision to betray Victoria's legal strategy having cost her family but preserved her integrity. Marcus stood in James's study, surrounded by evidence of his father's quiet empire, and realized he had no idea what to do with it. Keeping the properties felt like maintaining a monument to someone else's vision. Selling them felt like abandoning James's legacy. The paralysis kept him frozen, managing but not truly engaging with the inheritance, treating it like a responsibility to be maintained rather than a resource to be deployed toward any particular purpose. Rebecca called on a Thursday afternoon, her voice carrying the professional tone that meant this was business rather than the semi-personal check-ins she'd started making after the trial concluded. Marcus, I need you to come to my office. There's something your father left with me that I was instructed not to give you until 6 months after the will was probated. Today's the day. He drove to her office in Midtown, navigating traffic that seemed heavier than usual, Atlanta's perpetual construction making every route take longer than GPS predicted. Rebecca's firm occupied the 15th floor of a building with views stretching to the perimeter, her office decorated with law school diplomas and trial victories documented in framed newspaper articles. She gestured him to the chair across from her desk and pulled a sealed envelope from her safe, this one marked with James's handwriting that identified it as the final piece of whatever puzzle his father had been constructing. Your father gave me this 6 years ago, when he first retained me to handle his estate planning. He said you'd need 6 months to process the inheritance before you'd be ready for what's inside. I don't know what it contains, but he was very specific about timing. Marcus broke the seal and pulled out several pages, James's handwriting covering them front and back, the familiar script now carrying emotional weight that made reading difficult through the grief that still ambushed him at unexpected moments. Son, if you're reading this, 6 months have passed since my funeral. 6 months since Victoria knelt, since the inheritance transferred, since you discovered I'd been building something larger than you knew. I hope these months have given you time to understand that money wasn't the point. The point was teaching you that your worth exists independent of other people's judgment, that dignity comes from within rather than from external validation. The letter detailed James's vision for what Marcus should do with the inheritance, not instructions or demands, but suggestions born from 40 years of careful observation about what Atlanta needed and what resources could accomplish when deployed with intention rather than hoarded for security. The 23 properties aren't just investments, Marcus. They're homes. 23 families live in them right now. Working people who need safe housing they can afford, who struggle the way we struggled before I started building this portfolio. I kept their rent low deliberately, charged them enough to cover expenses, but not enough to maximize profit. Because profit wasn't the point. The point was providing stability. James proposed converting the properties into permanently affordable housing, creating a nonprofit foundation that would own them in perpetuity and ensure rents stayed capped at levels working families could manage, regardless of market pressures. He'd even drafted preliminary paperwork, had consulted with attorneys about structure and tax implications, had done everything except make the final decision, because that choice belonged to Marcus. You could keep them as investments, maximize rent, accumulate more wealth than our family could spend in 3 generations. There's nothing wrong with that choice. But I'm asking you to consider whether there's something more valuable than wealth accumulation, whether using resources to provide stability for families who need it might matter more than seeing how many zeros you can add to a bank account. The letter continued with detailed financial projections, estimates of how many families the foundation could house if Marcus converted all 23 properties, calculations about how the investment portfolio could generate enough income to maintain the properties without requiring Marcus to use his accounting salary. James had thought through every angle, had provided his son with a roadmap for turning inheritance into legacy, for using wealth as a tool rather than treating it as a trophy. One more thing, son. Set aside money for education, scholarships for kids whose families live in the foundation's properties, opportunities for them to escape the cycle of working 3 jobs to barely survive. I never got to finish college because your mother got sick and medical bills consumed everything we'd saved. You got to finish because I worked overtime for 8 years straight. Give other kids the chance I gave you. That's how wealth becomes legacy. Not through accumulation, but through creating opportunities that compound across generations. Marcus set the letter down and stared at Rebecca, who'd been watching him read with patient attention. Did you know what was in this? Your father discussed it with me when we drafted the estate plan. He wanted to make sure his vision was legally feasible before presenting it to you. The foundation structure is solid. Everything's ready to file if you decide to proceed. Marcus thought about the 23 properties, about the families living in them who had no idea their landlord had died and left them in the hands of someone who could choose profit or stability with equal legal right. He thought about his own childhood, about watching James work exhausting hours to keep them housed and fed, about the constant stress of never having quite enough cushion between income and disaster. He thought about Victoria's contempt for working people, about the casual cruelty of believing some lives mattered less than others because they earned less or struggled more or lacked the social polish that came from never having to worry about making rent. Let's do it. File the paperwork. Create the foundation. I want it called the James Reed Foundation for Housing and Education. And I want to set aside $2 million from the investment portfolio as endowment for scholarships. 30 students per year, full ride to any Georgia public university, prioritized for kids whose families live in our properties. Rebecca smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her that wasn't connected to courtroom victory or legal strategy. Your father knew you'd make this choice. He told me 6 years ago that you had his character, that money wouldn't corrupt what he'd built into you through example. He was right. Marcus spent the next 3 months working with Rebecca and the nonprofit's board to convert James's vision into operational reality. They hired a director who'd spent 20 years in affordable housing, brought on property managers who understood the mission wasn't profit maximization, established selection criteria for the scholarship program that emphasized need and potential rather than perfect grades or test scores. By month 4, the foundation was operational. The properties were formally transferred, and Marcus found himself at a press conference announcing the largest privately funded affordable housing initiative in Atlanta's history. The event took place at one of the properties, a renovated duplex in East Point that James had purchased in 1987 for $18,000 and transformed through careful maintenance into a solid home worth 10 times that amount in current market conditions. 50 people crowded into the small yard, reporters from local news stations, representatives from city government, families who'd be affected by the rent guarantees, and education advocates who'd spent careers fighting for scholarship opportunities that Marcus was now funding. The program director introduced him, provided background on the foundation's structure and goals, explained that 23 properties would house approximately 73 families with rent capped at $800 monthly, regardless of market rates, that 30 students per year would receive full scholarships funded by investment income that would compound over decades. Then Marcus stood before microphones and cameras, preparing to speak publicly about his father for the first time since the funeral that had launched this entire transformation. My father taught me that dignity isn't something you inherit or purchase. It's something you maintain regardless of circumstances. He worked maintenance jobs for 40 years while quietly building resources he could have used to make his own life easier. He chose not to. He chose to live simply so that when he was gone, his work could continue providing stability for families who needed it. Marcus talked about James's philosophy, about the difference between wealth accumulation and wealth deployment, about the responsibility that came with having resources when others struggled. He talked about the families who'd be housed, about the students who'd be educated, about the compounding effect of providing stability that allowed people to invest in their own futures rather than constantly scrambling to survive immediate crises. This foundation isn't charity. It's investment in the kind of community we want to build. My father believed working people deserved safe housing at prices that didn't force them to choose between rent and food, between keeping the lights on and taking their kids to the doctor. He believed education was the path to breaking cycles of poverty, that giving kids opportunities could transform entire families across generations. The James Reed Foundation exists to prove he was right. Questions came from reporters, most focused on numbers and logistics. A few aimed at Marcus's personal story and whether the foundation represented reaction to his own experiences with the Hartwell family. He deflected those, unwilling to turn his father's legacy into tabloid narrative about revenge or vindication, keeping focus on mission rather than personal drama that had already consumed too much public attention. The event concluded, people dispersing to tour properties or speak with foundation staff about eligibility and application processes. Marcus remained in the yard, watching families examine the duplex that would house one of them within the month, seeing kids run through grass that James had planted and maintained with his own hands decades ago. A woman approached, somewhere in her 40s, her work uniform suggesting she'd come directly from a shift, her face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who worked too many hours for too little money. Mr.
Reed, I'm Crystal Johnson. My family's been on the waiting list for affordable housing for 18 months. My caseworker said we're approved for one of your properties. I just wanted to say thank you. You don't know what this means. Marcus shook her hand, felt the roughness of someone who worked physical labor, saw the hope in her eyes that came from finally catching a break after months of grinding struggle. My father would be glad to know the properties are going to families who need them. That was always his intention. Crystal's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled a photo from her purse showing 2 kids around 8 and 10 years old. These are my babies, Marcus and James. I named them after my grandfather and great-grandfather, both good men who worked hard all their lives, but never caught breaks like this. Maybe my sons will grow up with enough stability to have real chances. Maybe they'll go to college on your scholarships. Maybe they'll remember there was a man named James Reed who cared enough about working families to build something that lasted beyond his own life. The words hit Marcus with unexpected force, the realization that his father's legacy would ripple through generations. The kids named Marcus and James would grow up in housing James had provided, that their chances in life would be better because one man had chosen purpose over profit decades ago. This was what wealth meant when deployed with intention. Not luxury for the owner, but stability for dozens of families, opportunities for hundreds of students, transformation that compounded across time in ways that made bank account balances seem trivial by comparison. Marcus watched Crystal Johnson walk back to her caseworker, watched her excitement as they discussed move-in dates and lease terms that would keep her rent stable regardless of what happened to Atlanta's housing market. He thought about his father working double shifts while secretly accumulating resources that would eventually house 73 families. He thought about Victoria's contempt for working people, about how she'd measured worth in dollars and social status, while James had measured it in dignity and character. He thought about 8 years of marriage where he'd been judged insufficient by people whose values James's foundation now actively opposed through its very existence. 2 years after James's death, Marcus stood in Oakland Cemetery beside his father's grave, the simple headstone reading, James Theodore Reed. He measured worth by character. The Foundation's second annual report sat in his briefcase, documenting impact that exceeded initial projections. 73 families housed, 60 students in college on full scholarships, 0 evictions or defaults. Waiting list growing faster than they could expand capacity. Rebecca had accompanied him to the cemetery, her presence having evolved from attorney to friend to something more tentative and promising over 24 months of working together on foundation business. They'd had coffee that turned into dinner that turned into conversations about life beyond legal strategy and nonprofit management. She understood the weight Marcus carried, the complicated grief mixed with pride, mixed with anger at discovering his father's secret only after death, made conversation impossible. She didn't push for more than Marcus could offer, didn't demand he move faster than his own healing timeline allowed.
Didn't try to replace Elena or fill some imagined void that required immediate filling. Your father would be proud. The foundation's impact exceeds anything most nonprofits achieve in their first decade. You've honored his vision while making it your own.
Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat that still emerged when he thought too directly about James's absence, about all the conversations they'd never have, about his father missing the chance to see his work transformed into something sustainable and growing. I wish he could see it. Wish I could show him the families living in his properties, the students graduating because of his planning. Wish I could thank him for teaching me that worth and wealth aren't the same thing. Rebecca took his hand, the gesture casual and comfortable in ways that suggested they'd moved past professional boundaries into territory that might eventually become something more significant. He knew. That's why he structured everything the way he did.
He knew you'd make this choice because he'd raised you to understand that character matters more than comfort, that dignity isn't negotiable, that using resources to help others compounds into legacy, while hoarding them compounds into nothing but bigger numbers. They stood together in silence, watching afternoon sun filter through oak trees that had witnessed 2 centuries of Atlanta's transformation from small town to major city. Somewhere in the distance, Marcus could hear kids playing, their voices carrying joy that came from afternoon freedom and the particular confidence of children who weren't worried about whether their family could afford dinner or rent or the field trip permission slip that cost $5 but might as well cost $500 for families living paycheck to paycheck. The foundation had changed his life in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with purpose. He'd left his accounting job, taken position as foundation director at a salary significantly less than he'd earned before, but sufficient for his needs. He spent his days managing properties and reviewing scholarship applications and meeting families whose lives improved because his father had chosen to build something that lasted. The work wasn't prestigious by Victoria Hartwell standards, didn't come with country club membership or invitations to exclusive social events, didn't signal status or sophistication, or whatever markers she'd used to measure worth. But it mattered. It mattered to 73 families who had stable housing. It mattered to 60 students who had college opportunities. It mattered to neighborhoods that benefited from maintained properties and invested residents. It mattered to Marcus, who woke up each morning knowing his work created tangible good, rather than just generating income that served no purpose beyond accumulation. He thought about Victoria occasionally, wondered whether her work at the housing nonprofit had changed her, or whether she simply performed the role without internalizing lessons about dignity and character. Natalie reported that Elena had continued therapy, had started dating someone who worked as a teacher, had begun building a life defined by her own values rather than her mother's expectations. Whether that transformation was genuine or temporary remained unclear, but Marcus had moved past needing to know, past measuring his own healing by whether Elena eventually understood what she'd lost. The foundation was his inheritance, his legacy, his daily reminder that James had been right about patience being rewarded, about dignity coming from within, about worth being measured by character rather than bank balances. Standing beside his father's grave with Rebecca's hand in his, Marcus finally understood what James had been trying to teach him through 4 decades of careful planning and quiet example. Wealth was a tool. Legacy was the structure you built with that tool. And dignity was the foundation on which everything else either stood or crumbled. His father had left him all 3, wrapped in an inheritance that looked like money, but actually consisted of something far more valuable. Proof that one life lived with intention could transform dozens of others across generations, that resources deployed with purpose mattered infinitely more than resources hoarded for security. The true wealth came from knowing your worth before inheriting your net worth. Marcus laid flowers on James's grave, simple chrysanthemums his father had always preferred over expensive arrangements, and whispered words meant only for the man who'd shaped everything Marcus had become. Thank you, Dad.
For the money, yes, but more for teaching me what to do with it. For showing me that dignity isn't negotiable, that patience gets rewarded, that worth comes from character. I miss you, but I'm doing the work. I'm building what you started, and I finally understand what you were trying to tell me all along. The afternoon sun continued its descent toward evening, casting long shadows across Oakland Cemetery's historic grounds, illuminating headstones that marked lives lived and legacies left. Marcus stood surrounded by evidence that some people's impact lasted long after their bodies stopped breathing, that careful planning and intentional action could create change that compounded across generations, that one maintenance supervisor's decision to live simply and build deliberately had transformed into housing for 73 families and education for hundreds of students, and a model other cities were already studying for replication. This was inheritance. Not money in accounts or properties on deeds, but purpose transmitted from father to son, values embedded so deeply that discovering wealth couldn't corrupt what patience and dignity had built into character over 35 years of quiet example. James Reed had left his son everything that mattered, and Marcus had finally learned to recognize the gift for what it truly was.